Imagine the sharp, rhythmic ache blooming in the arches of your feet, a dull heat that radiates up your calves with every single step. Your lungs don't burn yet, but your skin is coated in a fine, salty crust of dried sweat, and the air around you smells of sun-baked dust and crushed sage. This is the feeling of being human for 99% of our history. You aren't running from a predator, and you aren't chasing a meal. You are just moving. You are putting one foot in front of the other because the horizon is pulling at you like a magnet. We have this idea in our heads that ancient travel was a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival, a series of lucky accidents that landed us on different continents. We picture shivering bands of nomads stumbling into new lands by mistake, driven only by hunger or fear. But almost everything you've been told about how our ancestors conquered the planet is backwards. They weren't wandering aimlessly, they weren't trapped by the oceans, and they weren't limited by their own two legs. They were the most sophisticated navigators the world has ever seen, long before the first map was ever drawn. To understand how they did it, we have to cut the first tether of the Great Migration myth, the idea that ancient humans were just following their stomachs. The common story is that we followed herds of megafauna like slow-moving shadows, drifting across the landscape because the mammoths moved, and we simply had to keep up. But the evidence suggests something much more intentional. Archaeologists have looked at the way stone tools were distributed across vast distances, and what they found shatters the aimless wanderer image. In the Rift Valley of Africa, researchers found obsidian tools that had been transported over 200 miles from their volcanic source. This didn't happen because a group got lost. It happened because of a tether of information. These people knew exactly where the high-quality stone was, they knew how to get there, and they knew how to return. They were networking. They were trading. They were traveling with a destination in mind. When humans began leaving Africa roughly 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, it wasn't a single, desperate march. It was a calculated expansion. They were following coastal highways, utilizing the richest environments on the planet. They weren't just looking for food, they were looking for the edge of the world. But as they moved, they hit a barrier that should have stopped them cold. This brings us to the second great myth, the idea that the ocean was an impassable wall. For decades, the consensus was that humans didn't figure out water travel until very late in the game, perhaps only 10 or 12,000 years ago. We assumed that until the invention of the hollowed-out log, the deep blue was a death sentence. But that theory was demolished by a discovery on a tiny island called Flores in Indonesia. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, archaeologist Mike Morwood and his team found stone tools dating back 800,000 years. This wasn't even Homo sapiens. This was our ancestor, Homo erectus. The problem is that Flores has never, not once in millions of years, been connected to the mainland. Even when sea levels were at their lowest during the ice ages, there was a deep water trench between Flores and the nearest landmass that required a crossing of at least 15 to 20 miles of open, churning ocean. You cannot swim that distance by accident. You cannot drift there on a piece of driftwood with a family and tools and survive. The tether to the land had to be broken intentionally. These ancient hominids were building watercraft, likely bamboo rafts, hundreds of thousands of years before we thought it was possible. They weren't just land animals, they were mariners. The ocean didn't divide the world, it connected it. By the time Homo sapiens reached Southeast Asia around 65,000 years ago, they didn't see the Pacific as a barrier. They saw it as a path. Think about the crossing to Australia. This required a voyage across nearly 60 miles of open sea, into a horizon where no land was visible. They were sailing toward a ghost, a place they couldn't see but somehow knew was there. Whether they were following the smoke from distant bushfires or the migratory patterns of birds, they committed to the water. This wasn't a primitive feat, this was a high-stakes engineering triumph. They had to understand buoyancy, lashing, and the way currents tugged at a hull. When they finally landed on the shores of Sahul, the ancient supercontinent of Australia and New Guinea, they had completed a journey that no other large mammal had ever achieved. They didn't just walk across the world, they sailed it. But even as we mastered the waves, the most impressive technology we possessed was already attached to our bodies. The third myth we need to dismantle is the idea that ancient travel was slow and inefficient. We look at a modern hiker with high-tech boots and carbon fiber poles and think we've improved on the walking experience. In reality, the human body is a precision-engineered machine for distance, and our ancestors used it to outpace everything else on Earth. We are the only primates that are obligate bipeds, and our skeleton is a masterclass in energy conservation. When you walk, your Achilles tendon and the arches of your feet act like literal springs, storing mechanical energy and releasing it to propel you forward. This means your muscles don't have to do all the work. Compare this to a chimpanzee, which uses 4 times as much energy to move the same distance. But the real wow factor isn't just our feet, it's our cooling system. Most animals, like horses or cheetahs, can only shed heat by panting. They have to stop moving to cool down. Humans have millions of eccrine sweat glands. We can dump heat while we are in motion. This allowed our ancestors to engage in persistence hunting, where they would simply walk a deer or an antelope to death in the midday sun. The animal would eventually collapse from heatstroke, while the human just kept coming. Our slow, walking speed was actually our greatest tactical advantage. It was the tether of endurance that allowed us to cross continents that would have killed a more athletic animal. As the centuries blurred into millennia, the way we moved began to change, but not in the way you might expect. This leads us to the 4th myth, the myth of the lone explorer. We often imagine a single, brave family striking out into the unknown, isolated from everyone else. But the deeper we dig into the archaeological record, the more we see that ancient travel was a massive, interconnected social web. Take the site of Poverty Point in Louisiana, dating back about 3,500 years. Archaeologists have found thousands of stone artifacts there, but there is no natural stone at the site. The rocks were brought there from the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio River Valley, and the Great Lakes. This is a distance of over 1,000 miles. This wasn't a one-time trip. This was a permanent, multi-generational trade network. People were moving goods across a continent using a system of relays and trade partners. The tether of human connection was the real road. They didn't need a map because they had a story. They knew that if they walked north for 20 days and looked for the river that turned red at sunset, they would find people who had the stone they needed. Travel was a social currency. It was how you found a mate, how you found new technologies, and how you ensured your survival during a drought. If you believe the history books, the real revolution in travel didn't happen until someone finally invented the wheel. But this is the 5th and perhaps most pervasive myth of all. We are taught that the wheel is the ultimate sign of progress, the invention that changed everything. In reality, for most of human history, the wheel was a terrible way to get around. The oldest wheel we've ever found, discovered in the Ljubljana marshes of Slovenia, is about 5,200 years old. That sounds ancient, but remember, humans had already reached every corner of the globe by then. We had settled the high Andes, the Siberian tundra, and the remote islands of the Pacific without ever using a single wheel. Because a wheel is only useful if you have a flat, paved road. On a mountainside, in a swamp, or in a thick forest, a wheel is just a heavy, circular anchor that gets stuck in the mud. For thousands of years, humans used much more effective, low-tech solutions. We used the travois, 2 poles tied together that could be dragged behind a person or a dog. We used sleds that glided over grass as easily as they did over ice. The wheel wasn't a sudden leap forward. It was a niche tool that only became dominant once we started building massive, centralized empires that could afford to pave the earth. The primitive methods were actually more versatile, more durable, and more suited to the raw, wild planet our ancestors navigated. This brings us to the moment where the world truly shrank, the domestication of the horse. But even here, the myth is that we conquered the horse to become faster. The reality, uncovered by researchers like David Anthony, who studied the Butai culture in Kazakhstan, is that the horse was originally a food source that we realized could also carry a pack. The tether to our own physical limits didn't break because we wanted to go 30 miles an hour. It broke because we wanted to carry more stuff. Before the horse, a human was limited by what they could fit in a basket or on their back. Once we partnered with animals, first dogs, then donkeys, then horses and camels, our cargo capacity exploded. This allowed for the first true long-distance trade caravans. It allowed for the movement of grain, ore, and textiles across thousands of miles of desert and steppe. The horse didn't just make us faster, it made us heavier. It allowed us to bring our civilization with us wherever we went. But if we want to see the pinnacle of ancient travel, we have to look away from the land and back to the sea. The Polynesian expansion is perhaps the single most incredible feat of navigation in human history, and it completely defies the myth that ancient people were primitive. Starting about 3,000 years ago, these explorers set out from Southeast Asia and eventually settled nearly every habitable island in the 10 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean. They did this without compasses, without sextants, and without metal tools. They used a technique called wayfinding. A master navigator could read the ocean like a book. They could feel the difference between a swell generated by a distant storm and a swell reflected off a hidden island. They could tell by the color of the underside of a cloud if there was a lagoon beneath it. They could track the stars with such precision that they knew their exact latitude by the height of a single zenith star overhead. This wasn't just travel, this was a high-level mathematical and sensory discipline. When they reached Hawaii or Easter Island, they weren't lost. They were exactly where they intended to be. The tether of the stars was the only map they needed. So, why does this matter? Why do we need to bust these myths? Because when we view our ancestors as primitive wanderers, we lose sight of what we actually are. We are not a species that happened to settle the world. We are a species designed for the journey. Our biology, our social structures, and our very brains are built to handle the unknown. Every time you feel that itch to travel, that restless urge to see what's over the next hill, you are feeling a 300,000-year-old biological imperative. We didn't solve the problem of distance with the internal combustion engine. We solved it with the human foot, the bamboo raft, and the collective memory of the tribe. The modern world, with its highways and flight paths, is just a new layer of paint on a map that was finished tens of thousands of years ago. The unifying truth behind all these busted myths is that travel was never about the tools. It was about the intention. We moved because we were curious, because we were social, and because we refused to be contained by the horizon. We were never trapped in Africa, and we were never stopped by the sea. We didn't wait for the wheel to tell us it was time to go. We looked at the stars, we looked at the distance, and we realized that the only thing holding us back was the fear of the first step. The ancient world wasn't a series of isolated pockets of humanity, it was a giant, pulsing network of people who were constantly in motion, trading stories and obsidian and DNA across thousands of miles. Think back to that feeling in your feet, that burning in your lungs. To an ancient traveler, that wasn't a sign to stop. It was a sign that they were alive. It was the physical proof that they were expanding the boundaries of the known world. We often talk about exploring as if it's something only a few famous men in funny hats did in the 1400s. But every single one of your ancestors was an explorer. If they hadn't been, you wouldn't be here. You are the descendant of people who walked across glaciers, who paddled into the empty blue of the Pacific, and who crossed the Sahara with nothing but a leather water skin and the knowledge of where the next well was hidden. They were the masters of the planet long before they had the machines to prove it. The tether that once bound us to a single valley or a single shore has been stretched until it's nearly invisible, but it's still there. It's in the way we build our cities along old trade routes. It's in the way our languages share common roots across entire continents. It's in the way we still look at the horizon and wonder what's on the other side. We didn't conquer the world by being the strongest or the fastest. We conquered it by being the most restless. We are the species that moves. We are the ones who can't stay still. And that restlessness is the most powerful technology we have ever possessed. As you sit there now, perhaps in a climate-controlled room or moving at 60 miles an hour in a car, remember the rhythm of those first steps. Remember that your comfort is a very recent invention, a brief pause in a journey that has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. The roads you drive on today are often just paved-over versions of the paths your ancestors wore into the earth with their bare feet. The flights you take across the ocean are just faster versions of the voyages taken on bamboo rafts. We haven't changed nearly as much as we think we have. We're still just trying to see what's over the next hill. Think about the sheer audacity of those first explorers. Imagine standing on a beach in Southeast Asia 60,000 years ago, looking out at an ocean that seems to go on forever, and deciding that you're going to build something that floats and head out into the blue. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice. It was the choice to trade the safety of the known for the possibility of the unknown. That choice is the foundation of everything we have ever built. It's the reason we have science, the reason we have art, and the reason we have a global civilization. It all started with a single person who decided that the place they were standing wasn't enough. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, looking back at our primitive ancestors with a sort of pity. But could you do what they did? Could you navigate 1,000 miles of open ocean using nothing but the feel of the waves? Could you walk across a continent with no map and no GPS, finding your way by the shape of the hills and the memory of a story your grandfather told you? Our ancestors weren't less capable than us. In many ways, they were more tuned into the world than we could ever hope to be. They had to be. Their lives depended on it. They didn't have the luxury of being lost. So, the next time you look at a map of the world, don't just see countries and borders. See the footprints. See the millions of miles of walking, the thousands of years of paddling, and the endless search for a better place to call home. The world wasn't discovered by Europeans in the 15th century. It was discovered, mapped, and mastered by people whose names we will never know, but whose legacy is written in our very bones. They were the original long-distance travelers, and they did it all without a single drop of gasoline. Which of these ancient travel myths surprised you the most? Did you realize that Homo erectus was likely building rafts 800,000 years ago, or that the wheel was actually a latecomer to the transportation game? It's incredible how much of our history we've been taught to view through a lens of modern superiority. If you find these deep dives into our hidden history fascinating, consider subscribing. It's a quiet way to join us as we keep exploring these forgotten paths. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you had to travel 1,000 miles on foot with only what you could carry, what is the one modern tool you'd be most terrified to leave behind? Our ancestors didn't just survive the journey across the planet. They sought it out with a precision and intelligence that we are only just beginning to understand. We often think of our history as a slow climb toward the light of technology, but the truth is that the light was there from the beginning. It was the fire in the mind of the first person who looked at a mountain and didn't see a wall, but a challenge. We are the children of the horizon. We are the descendants of the ones who kept going when everyone else would have turned back. And that brings us to the final, unsettling truth of our expansion. We didn't colonize the Earth because we were looking for a place to stop. We did it because we are a species that cannot ever be satisfied with where we are. We have already walked across every continent and sailed across every ocean. We have climbed the highest peaks and descended into the deepest trenches. And now, as we look up at the stars, we're starting to realize that the planet wasn't the destination. It was just the training ground. Your ancestors didn't walk across the world to find a home. They walked because they were looking for an exit.